This is a continuation of episode 278, which I called Has Your Network Abandoned You? Let's discuss how to plan to get it back. I talked previously how to identify who to network with and what was strategic networking. I want to discuss in this episode how to ease back into networking. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 280 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. This is a continuation from episode 278, which I called Has Your Network Abandoned You? Let's discuss how to plan to get it back. I talked previously how to identify who you need to network with and what was strategic networking. I want to discuss in this episode how to ease back into networking and further identify who you need to network with. I was giving a webinar for AustinUp the other day, and someone posed the question about pivoting from product marketing to product management. They were not having much luck. In order to make this kind of move, it will almost always take a relationship to get you across. And it's probably a relationship you do not have right now. In episode 278, we discussed identifying who you need to network with. Some of these people will be existing connections, while others will be new connections. We will focus on existing connections and building up the network muscles that probably have atrophied during the last couple of years. I will once again give you some blog posts to read about active listening and a step-by-step process to ease back into networking. However, before we get to the episode, let's have a word from our sponsor, Career Pivot. The Career Pivot membership community is a group of people from all over the U.S. and Canada with diverse backgrounds. This is a community where everyone is there to help everyone else out, figure out what they want to do in the second half of life, and then make it happen. Many have made changes that they didn't know existed or was possible when they came to the community. They learned from each other and broadened their horizons on what was really possible. Let's hear what Dean had to say about being part of the community.
First of all, you never know. There's always just a little push over the line to get you started, right? So when I first joined the community, the idea then was, I'm in this particular job and I don't want to stay at this particular job for the rest of my life. And so whatever that push needs to be, it still needs to be there. And I need to try to figure out what that is. I can remember we were over the weeks that we've been doing community meetings, people saying, hey, look, I could listen to your book, or I think you would do good at doing voice work. So that encouragement, I think that's been good from the community, is just to be able to talk to people, hear their opinions. I know that, for example, we were talking about the first book I did, and I remember, Mark, you were like, well, some of the reading was a little monotone, and it was, but it didn't hurt my feelings. I mean, I agree with you, right? I mean, it was my first book. It is what it is, and things like that are good to have, I think. And I think if somebody's looking to be a part of the community, that's one of the things they can look forward to with this.
I'm recruiting new members. If you are interested in learning more about the endeavor, please go to careerpivot.com/community. Now on to discussing how to ease back into networking. So a lot of the ideas that I'm going to talk about today come from my buddy Tom Singer, who's a full-time or was a full-time professional speaker who mostly spoke to association conferences about networking, Tom just took a job as the CEO of the Austin Technology Council, which still allows Tom to pursue his speaking business, but he needed to find a job because the speaking business is coming back much slower than people thought it would. And he recorded a video called Awaken Dormant Ties, which I then turned into a blog post. And one of the things he talked about was you need to start reaching out to your past ties and reawakening them. And I talk about the fact that I have a blog post out there, how people think about you may be frozen in time. This came from my buddy Carol Fishman Cohen, who runs iRelaunch, where people know you as you were. So if you haven't seen someone for several years, they remember you from your past, not who you are today. And that's real important because a lot of times we say, I don't want to reach out to people. This is difficult. So what Tom suggests is go to LinkedIn, pull up your contacts, and pick a letter. Tom suggested M. And then go through your list of contacts that begin with M, select 5 to 10 people to reach out to. These should be people you had a real relationship at one time. And then send them an email, pick up the phone, call them. If you call them, you're likely to get a voice message and just simply to say, hey, I thought of you today and wondering how you are doing. Of those 5 to 10 people, how many will respond? Well, some of them will. Not all of them will. Some may respond and say, thank you for thinking of me, but take no action. But other people will say, okay, it's time to get out and talk to people. I know the fact that a lot of you are probably going, oh my gosh, I'm going to meet somebody in person. These people I want you to start meeting with people one-on-one. Do it in places where you feel comfortable. Outside, in venues that you are completely comfortable with, and get started. Now, when I did this about a year ago in May of 2021, my wife and I went back to Austin. We got our vaccinations, the first rounds, and I had 26 coffee meetings in 28 days. I've got a podcast episode. I talked about this. And what I realized was my active listening skills really, really sucked. I hadn't used them in a long time. So one of the things I want you to do is before you start meeting people, I want you to start practicing some of your active listening skills. And I've got a blog post. Again, I'm going to list all this in my in the show notes. The idea of active listening is asking open-ended questions. And then once you've got them talking, because this is not about you, it is about them, then start asking probing questions. Dig into it a little bit more. One of the things I found that I didn't do well at was asking the probing questions, but more importantly, coming back and paraphrasing what they said, and then coming back and summarizing what they said. If I paraphrase and then summarize, it means I've actually listened. And one of the things we find when you're in a job search or you're just out networking, you're focused on you and what your needs are, not what their needs are. So I really want you to practice this before you start meeting people. Get out and start meeting people one-on-one. This should not be about a job search necessarily. It should be how you're coping, how you're doing, how they are doing. And it should be in a neutral, non-judgmental period. Please be patient. If there's silence, let it be silence. So periods of silence are not filled. So be patient. Be very, very cognizant of verbal and nonverbal feedback to show signs of listening. Make sure and ask for clarifications. Talk to people. And by the way, this is going to take probably 5 or 10 one-on-one meetings before you feel comfortable doing this. I know it took me 5 or 6 of those one-on-one meetings to start getting my networking muscle back together. Once you feel safe with that, then start saying, okay, I want to start getting a group of people together, and let's do it at a park. Let's go outside. Let's meet at a local outside bar and have a beer. Get a group of people that you feel comfortable with and start getting used to interacting in groups. This is one of the challenges when we have a group of people who, you kind of know, you've known in the past, but you haven't. Most of us haven't done this outside of our family. And then part 3 is to start attending small professional events. Again, focuses on the other people. This is not about you. It's about them. Once you have successfully done that, you can start going to larger and larger networking events. Now, we're about to have BA5 Omicron variant coming out, and I know I have friends who are coming down with it. Be smart, but you're going to have to start getting back out and networking. If you really want to move your career forward, particularly if you've been unemployed, or you want to move forward, you're going to need to get out there. It's just, I can't tell you the number of people I have talked to who have said that every new job they've always gotten is through a connection. So get back in the habit of making connections. And I'm going to end that on that note. It is time to get out and network. Read the blog post that I referenced, which I will link to in the show notes. Also, let me know what you think about these shorter, non-interview episodes. Email me at podcast@careerpivot.com. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You will get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. I just published my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. If you're subscribed to the newsletter, you will have the opportunity to download it. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on Facebook and LinkedIn. You'll also find me at Twitter at Career Pivot. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-280. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. And if you're still listening, make sure and hit that subscribe or follow button. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.